Hello, everyone. Welcome to Writers Talk, the Writers Write podcast, where we talk about writers and writing. I'm Christopher Dean from Writers Write, and today my co-host will be
Oliver Fox.
Thanks for being here, Oliver. Today we're going to be talking about fantasy in general, and that's very appropriate because Oliver has just finished writing the Fantasy Workbook, which you can buy on writerswrite.co.za. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about it, Oliver?
Yeah, so I've, as I just mentioned to you a little while ago off the podcast, I've always had sort of a odd, not really odd, but just not a literary entry point into fantasy until very recently. I've read all the contemporary classics like Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings and things of that nature, but for a long time, my literary education on fantasy was pretty limited. I was mostly familiar with the genre through TV shows and video games and movies and things of that nature. And I found myself writing more and more fantasy-inspired stories, but they were drawing from those wells, television, video games. I decided it was time to dig into kind of the source. And with contemporary fantasy, classic fantasy. And I began making about a year and a half, 2 years ago, a study of it, a formal study, reading the modern classics and reading craft books. And over the time, I just realized just how much information there is and just how deep that rabbit hole goes. And after a while of that, it was a lot of fun getting to read these books and these works on craft of writing fantasy. But I wanted to kind of keep some more condensed compendium of notes. I thought, well, hey, I've got this. This is something I wish I had a singular resource that I could go to answer most all of the foundational questions you could have about fantasy. And just add some exercises to that so that you can actually engage with some of the concepts and practice them. Because it's one thing to have head knowledge and it's another thing to actually do it. So yeah, that's how this kind of all came about. And it was a lot of fun. It was very, very informative for me. And I wanted to pass that along to some of y'all's readers.
And it's very easy to follow. I help proofread it and edit. And it's just very informative and gets straight to what every writer needs to know about writing fantasy. It gives various options as well for whatever kind of fantasy world you could think of making. From something like Star Wars, sort of space saga kind of space opera kind of fantasy, to just your standard Lord of the Rings, elves, dwarves, and magic kind of sword and sandals fantasy, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I tried to cover a lot of ground, but it doesn't spend a lot of time getting down in the weeds about the theory behind it or the lore. I mean, I touch on some of those things a little bit, but primarily I'm focused on the nuggets that you need to.
I'd say it's like a really practical guide. I mean, that's always more useful to a writer than knowing about the theory of something. Although, of course, if you want to know about that, there's nothing wrong with knowing about that either.
No, so I read literally every craft book I could find on sci-fi and fantasy, and there's really not that many. Probably the most prominent one that I found was Orson Scott Card's on writing a fantasy and science fiction. And it's a very slender little craft book. And there are tremendous insights in it. But you have to get through a lot of personal storytelling to get to that stuff. And I feel like
that's always the case for those sort of things, isn't it?
Yeah, and that was a lot of them, actually. It was mostly them talking, waxing poetic about, how they came to the genre and I mean, like literally almost entire chapters just dedicated to how they wrote a particular story or something along those lines. And it's like, this is fascinating, but I'm really here for the, for lack of a better term, the recipe, you know?
No,
Um,
so Terry Pratchett wrote two books before he died, A Slip of the Keyboard and The Blink of an Eye, or Blink of a Screen, I think. And they're both
yeah,
sort of autobiographies. One is sort of about articles he's written, and the other one is, you know, speeches or things he's given, and just
yeah,
his general thoughts on writing and his life and whatnot. And you know, both of them are about 300 pages long. And I think if you're looking at just getting some writing advice for something like that, it's probably a good 15 pages of
yeah,
worthwhile information
right,
in the thing. Very entertaining otherwise, but you know.
yeah.
And the same with Stephen King's on writing. A lot
On
of it is
writing,
just
yeah,
him telling you about his childhood.
yes, yeah.
And
That's
at the same time, it's a lot of useful stuff that comes out of there as well.
absolutely. And I'm not knocking that style. That's more of, I guess, what I would call creative nonfiction. But for me, it's one of those things where it's not false advertising, but I'm a very pragmatic reader. If something claims to me that it is a craft book, that is what I'm coming to it for. You know, I'm coming to it to learn craft. You know, if I want to read a memoir, I'll go read a memoir.
And exactly. And this is definitely a workbook, and it'll get you
Right.
straight to work. So I thought what we could do today is look at a couple of all-time greats in terms of fantasy.
Yeah.
And to do that, you know, it's impossible for us to quantify, you know, what you should and shouldn't read. So I thought, why don't we get some other people to do that? And I just Googled and found Times 100 best fantasy books of all time. They had a couple of well-known authors
Yeah.
uh, making this list. Neil Gaiman, George R. R. Martin stand out as people that are particularly well-known,
Mm-hmm.
and then some other minor, but you know, pretty good fantasy writers. You can, I'll leave a link to the article in the description. You can have a look if you want. So we're just going to mention if we think this list is any good, and
Yeah.
if we think it's lacking in any way. And I think I'm just going to dive into a few things that I noticed when going through it. Is that there are definitely all of the things. Well, most of the works I would expect to be here are here,
Yeah.
and some of them are some of them are quite surprising in like what they were. So if you're looking at some of the older things that are on here, we have Arabian Nights and
Right.
Le Mort d'Arthur, where the Death of Arthur were put up by Thomas Mallory, which is possibly the first fanfic ever made. So it's a sort of retelling of the Arthurian story, but he just sort of
Yeah.
invents characters. I think this is where Galahad comes from. I don't think Galahad
Okay.
was actually a part of the Arthurian myth before this. And he's supposed to sort of be this combination of all the best characters of all the knights.
Mm-hmm.
So he's just this sort of, you know, your, I don't know, almost your, what's that term? Machine of God?
Apotheosis.
Just like a perfect solution to any problem.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Deus Ex Machina.
Deus Ex Machina. Thank you.
Yeah.
And it's a great piece of history. Well, what do you think of including something like Arabian Nights and the Arthurian myths in fantasy?
So I understand why these are here, and I understand why some people would be frustrated that they are here. I think, and it's funny that you brought up this list because I've seen this. I follow several fantasy forums on different platforms, and I remember when this came out, there was a lot of discussion about it, both for and against it. And that was one of the questions that people had. In fact, I mean, I just took a speculative fiction class, and a lot of people were debating about this exact thing. You know, is Arabian Nights. Fantasy is Le Morte d'Arthur. Fantasy. Um,
So I mean,
and
I'm not gonna argue about whether it is fantasy or not.
yeah,
I just wonder. I don't
does
think
it?
I would have read either of those things in their original form if I hadn't done some form of postgraduate English degree.
Gotcha.
You know,
Okay, you're
so I mean,
thinking
in
more
terms of Arabian Nights, you'll definitely know the stories,
right.
but whether you've actually gone and found original translated scripts transcripts of Arabian Nights is probably unlikely.
Yeah,
Same with the original Le Morte d'Arthur. I mean, it's in Old English or French. I'm not sure which, but it's not accessible to anyone who really wants to just read it casually.
right. Yeah. So you're talking about how this may be in the modern context of the word fantasy. This list might be a little off-putting because this is not what people think of as modern fantasy, nor is it really the sort of things that they would seek out.
I'm not sure about that. I don't know if it deserves a place in 100 books of all time
Right.
sort of greatness, if you know what I
Gotcha.
mean by that. Um, but I think that might be just but maybe it does because we get so much derived from them. I mean,
Right.
if you're just looking at Arabian Nights, you have your Aladdin kind of Disney movies that come from there. Um, the idea of genies in general and jinn and
Yeah.
spirits and all those sort of Arabian creatures. And then in the Arthurian myths, obviously, you get an Arthurian mythos movie coming out, what, every 2 or 3 years, remaking the
Yeah.
story.
Yeah. I mean, I mean, that's the chivalric romance is probably the archetypal fantasy plot. The hero of legend, of prophecy receives a summons from the wise old mentor, and they go seek the magic weapon and go on a quest and get their allies and defeat the dark forces, dark lord or sorceress or what have you, and slay the dragon and save the princess. I mean, it's not all exactly that beat for beat, but that's the archetypal chivalric romance. And so
I remember writing an essay in university on how the Morte Arthur was just ripping off Star Wars the entire time.
that's
My medieval professor wasn't entirely thrilled with me, but I thought it was a well-written article.
no,
Um,
I love it.
but yeah, I mean, that's where we get all the epic stories from, in terms of that style of story, anyway. As you were
Yeah,
saying, with your sort of farm boy hero going off to slay like the Dark Lord or Dark Lady or whatever.
right.
So
Yeah,
maybe in that terms, I agree with them. It deserves a mention at least as being the basis of
absolutely.
a lot of these other works.
And I think that's maybe the point of contention for some people, which is, are they foundational texts? Absolutely. Are they the most,
Impactful
informative
or
works?
best, maybe not.
Yeah, are they the most compelling, and do they stand up as well today? Maybe not. It's more the sort of thing that, if you wanted to take a deep academic dive to understand the origins of the genre, yeah, give it a shot. But for your average reader, it's going to be confusing and perhaps a little bit dull.
And then another sort of area with the list I take a little bit. Uh, I don't think it's executed particularly well in this regard. Is it has a bunch of C.S. Lewis books in the same series, and then all of the Lord of the Rings books as well,
Yeah,
individually represented.
I thought that was odd too. Where it was
Um,
like they'll have different parts of the book at different rankings, and that is very odd to me.
I mean, yeah, that's strange enough in itself. But I mean, if you're putting all 7 of the Narnia books and all three of the Lord of the Rings books. That's suddenly
Right.
almost, well, that's 10% of the list by just two authors on on essentially two series. I think maybe that shouldn't have been allowed. That sort of thing. I should have said
Right.
Lord of the Rings series or whatever other series.
Yeah. I can kind of understand it with Narnia, just given that it is sort of an episodic, not really a unitive episodic story. It's not like Harry
Sure,
Potter, where
sure. Yeah, that
there's a
is true.
causal relation between the different quote unquote episodes being books. It's sort of little snapshots of different eras, not necessarily told in order. So I can kind of understand that with Narnia. With Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, it makes less sense to me.
I think they did have Harry Potter in here somewhere, but they just had the
Mm-hmm.
one book. So they've sort of maybe they've thought that exact thing. Like, no, each one of these books stands by itself as a, great of all time,
Sure.
which I don't agree with, but I can see that sort of thing.
Well, so they included The Prisoner of Azkaban and Half-Blood Prince, which are two of the books that are often argued to be, the best in that series. The Prisoner of Azkaban being considered the best of the early books, and Half-Blood Prince often considered to be the best of the later ones. Um, so that's an interesting choice, but Azkaban is the only one of those two that I would argue you can read as a standalone book, and even then it would be a little confusing. I don't think you could have a hope of reading Half-Blood Prince on its own and have any idea what's going on if you hadn't read
No,
the
no,
this.
certainly not. I mean, it's such a continuous developing story.
Yeah,
It'd be strange jumping into it midway through, though
yeah,
I suppose some people must have.
yeah. And Azkaban was the last one where she even tried to present it as a standalone story. Where the first three books, like she kind of covers the same ground in the first two chapters, explaining who these characters are, why they're here, what they're doing, all that sort of thing. And by the time she got to Azkaban, she was like, oh, okay, I don't have to really do this anymore, because the people who are reading this are the people who read the first
Yeah,
couple books.
no, sure. I mean, I'm sure that's true. I mean, who hasn't read all of the Harry Potter books at some point, or at least
Yeah.
been forced to by a friend? But it's nice to see there's sort of such diversity, right? I mean, you
Yeah.
have something as serious as maybe not serious, but something as serious in tone as The Lord of the Rings, and then something as lighthearted as Harry Potter popping up.
Yeah.
Although some people might argue that Harry Potter is not exactly lighthearted, but to me it's sort of almost like a comedy fantasy.
Sure.
In some regards, anyway. And then you have, I think, The Wizard of Earthsea. That's stuck out as something worthwhile as part of any fantasy list, as far as I'm concerned. I don't know if I necessarily agree with it being particularly well written or anything, but it certainly has a very unique presence on the fantasy world in terms of how people view it. And some people love Ursula Le Guin, and I think some people are quite bored by the way that that series of books sort of plays out. I don't know if have you read The Wizard of Earthsea?
So I've actually read her craft books, and so I've gotten a good sense of who she is as a writer and how she does things. I also began watching Wizard of Earthsea, the Studio Ghibli film.
Yes, yeah. I was going to bring that up.
Quickly stopped, and didn't finish it. So I have a good sense of what kind of author she is, and I can understand why people would definitely definitely be fascinated by her approach. It is a more, I guess, slow, contemplative, what some people might call a literary approach to fantasy. So yeah, but I haven't read the specific books. No.
I'll just say that the way it's written is strange because I don't remember. I mean, I remember what the main character's name was and basically what sort of happened throughout the. I don't really remember any other character in the book very
Yeah.
clearly, or have a strong idea of what is at stake at any point, or why I should really care about it. But I kept reading
Right.
it, um, and it just sort of you kept feeling like the need to turn the page, which is obviously a great thing in any book.
Right.
I don't understand why I did it and just give up on it.
Gotcha.
I'm sure someone can answer that better. But the reason I was going to bring up the Studio Ghibli um, movie was because there's also Howl's Moving Castle on this list.
Yeah.
And I did not know that that was an American book.
Yes. And it's actually one that it's fascinating because I've heard it mentioned a lot more recently. People who love reading the book and contrasting and comparing it with the film, and some people think that the film is just a complete misrepresentation of the book. Some people think it's fascinating to see this very American story told through Miyazaki's lens, and he is, staunchly not Western in the way that he approaches uh, fantasy and storytelling in general.
That's certainly true. I mean, he does love Western themes, though. I mean, he's
Yes.
always, there's a lot of dragons and knights and European sort of
Yeah.
settings in Miyazaki's work.
Yeah, it's there's one of two options it seems. He'll either do it in some sort of nondescript but still obviously um, Western Europe. It's either France or Germany,
Yeah,
um, or he'll do it in Japan. Those
yeah,
seems
yeah.
to be the two settings for him. And he does like I guess the trappings of Western fantasy, but the execution is distinctly
The the
Japanese.
way the way a movie made by him tells a story is completely different in that it doesn't really follow the pattern you'd expect it to. It sort of comes to a conclusion just when things sort of get interesting.
Yeah,
In a lot of times. I mean, Husband Castle is not different. I don't actually know if the book is different. Maybe that is just the way the book is paced. It's sort of
that's
at
not
the point
I was
where
given.
you'd sort of imagine like the climax of the story to happen. It often just
Yeah,
ends.
yes.
Um,
Well, and that comes from this is something that I've actually been studying a lot recently. So in Eastern storytelling, they use a structure called Kisho Tenketsu. Have you heard of
Kiko
this?
Tenketsu. No, I haven't.
Okay, so it's fascinating because it's a poetic structure. I mean, it was used for poems. Key is the introduction, usually of the characters in the setting. Show is the development, so just showing not any sort of conflict or plot, but that those characters' daily lives. And then it's only in the third act that you get any conflict, and it's not even really any sort of what we would think of in the West, where the character is trying to overcome some obstacle. It's just a twist, a revelation of new information that kind of recontextualizes everything that came before, and then the resolution is the final act. And this is seen throughout the Eastern canon, particularly in the Journey to the West, which is like the great Chinese epic.
Right.
But he and even Nintendo is really big on implementing this structure, at every level of their storytelling. So I think that that's probably where that odd sort of slow build meandering. Oh, finally the conflict has hit in the third act, and the reason why I think that to us it feels so strange is it's we're used to the conflict coming in at the very beginning. Maybe the first or at the very latest the second act, definitely not the third. But it's something that I've been digging into more and more lately, and I've seen it in one of my entry points into fantasy, which is the Final Fantasy video game series, and that's exactly how it works there too. You spend the first 2/4 of the game just getting to know the characters and the world, and it's not until the third act, which could be 25 hours in, that you actually find out what the conflict is.
Right.
It's I don't think that's how it works in the book, and I think that's why at least Western American readers, when they read the book, they're like, oh yes, this is my thing, and then they see the movie and they're like, what on earth is going on here?
It does seem a lot of that sort of like, so there's some sort of world war going on in this book, I would imagine, and you sort of see that in the background of the movie.
Yes.
Probably that features more prominently in the book. I imagine
so.
Some of the conflict is actually explained rather than just, set to music as like a brief sort of interlude piece.
Aside.
Yeah. But I think it is a very interesting work in and of itself. Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't disagree with it being part of a list like this. It's certainly an interesting depiction of witches and wizards, written by a woman as well.
Right.
Which it's always interesting when you have the male and female perspective of magic being portrayed by a man or a woman.
Right.
And like a criticism of fantasy is that it has often been written by men. Or mostly written by men. Science fiction still sort of, I say, has that problem in sort of like 90-10 split. But fantasy over the last maybe 40 years has got a number of really good female writers I'd be happy to recommend.
Oh, absolutely. And it may be not necessarily that it has been more male writers. It may just be that those were the ones who got more attention until recently. I'm not really sure. I'm just putting that out there as a possibility.
I sort of suspect that I think women were expected to write more romance-related stories.
Sure.
And tended towards that, just in terms of publishing houses and what they expected to be written.
Right.
And so in the early days of fantasy, you don't really see many female authors writing fantasy. Although before it became a genre in the modern sense.
Yes.
With you got Shelley, right? Frankenstein.
Yeah. Yes.
Is maybe one of the first sort of fantasy kind of science fiction books ever written. And,
a lot of people consider her the kind of the grandmother, the godmother of modern speculative fiction, because she really does have all three genres present there: sci-fi, fantasy, and horror in one book.
Yeah. So, I mean, certainly at any point in history, women have been writing fantasy books.
Right.
Particularly, I think sort of also in the East, it was more normal.
Right.
To write sort of fantasy books, and there are a few well-known like Japanese authors in sort of like the Middle Ages who did that sort of writing as well.
Right.
But besides Howl's Moving Castle, I thought it was a bit strange for another modern book to be on here, and that was Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman.
Okay.
And I thought,
I just read this recently, so I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on this.
I don't think it's very good.
Okay.
And I wonder if it would have made the list if he wasn't, one of the judges. That's
Gotcha. Oh, was he one of the judges?
yeah, which sort of
Oh,
makes it even stranger to me that it is on here. I think
that's
it's fine. I think, he obviously has got a nice way of writing, and it's very easy to read. But I don't think it's a great. I think it's an okay book.
yeah. It's fascinating that you mentioned that. I bet you because there was a book on here that I absolutely adore, but I'm still surprised to see it on here, which is Get in Trouble by Kelly Link. I think she's a fantastic author. She's possibly my favorite author, but and she definitely dabbles in fantasy, primarily, I guess, low or urban fantasy. She kind of riffs on a lot of contemporary, more kitschy or campy tropes. But she very rarely does anything resembling high fantasy or portal fantasy or anything like that. But I know that Neil Gaiman is a big fan of hers, and so I'm wondering if he's the one who submitted that book
Yeah,
um,
I
for
think that's probably true. Quite a
uh,
few of the books that are on this list, I would say, are not particularly well known, even.
yeah. So so Neverwhere being included on here, it is fascinating because I it started life as a mini series, right? BBC
Yeah, I
mini.
think it was part of a publication in a magazine or something like
Yeah.
that. Yeah,
Well, no, I think it was a television show initially.
that could be true as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, no,
So
no,
I
no,
know
no.
that
A
there's
radio drama. Radio drama.
so the radio drama came out fairly recently, but
Really?
I think that yeah. So the one with yeah, because so this was one of the reason why I'm semi familiar with this one is because I had to read it for a sci-fi and fantasy class, grad school class recently, and we talked about how what an odd bird of a book it is because it started out as a BBC miniseries. It did not get a lot of attention. It was not super well
Oh,
received,
yes, yeah, yeah.
and Neil Gaiman was kind of constrained by the network. They made him, actually follow a plot and cut a bunch of unnecessary extra stuff, and he wasn't very satisfied with it. And I can't remember if it was just a year later or quite a few years later, but he decided to just rewrite it as a book. And so he went about the very strange process of turning a series of scripts into a novel. And then not long ago, I think it was in like 2010 or so, James McAvoy starred in a radio drama version of it. Um, and so it's been adapted, and I think Gaiman also wrote that one, and plays a few roles in it as well. But yeah, it's an interesting choice for this list because I don't know if it's got classic status yet, and it's archetypal to the point of maybe being overly familiar and maybe even a little on the nose as far as what its intended message is. So it's an odd choice for the list, and even odder given the fact that he was one of the judges.
Yes, and there's actually three Neil Gaiman books on the list. There's also
Good Omens,
American Gods and Good Omens.
yeah,
Good Omens is very entertaining. Again, I don't know if it's the best 100 books, fantasy books of all time. If you're only going to include one Perry Pratchett book, I think there's better ones.
right.
Certainly more well-written books, which are actually more fantasy than Good Omens really is. Good Omens is sort of it's in a genre of fantasy, but it's like a sort of Christian fiction almost. deals with angels and demons.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
it's not like a Constantine, which is also, I suppose, partly a Neil Gaiman
Yeah.
work as well. But it doesn't have any horror sort of elements into it. It's just a sort of love drama comedy about the end of the world, which has been turned into a very nice Amazon series, I think. So anyone who is interested might start there. Very faithfully adapted, I think.
Yes, it's gotten a lot of acclaim critically, and the audience seems to really like it. I know that Neil Gaiman worked very closely on the adaptation as well.
Yeah, nice. I think it was very well done. American Gods is another one. Obviously, I just mentioned. I think that is probably a better contender for this list.
Sure.
In that, at least in its sort of conception, is that a word? The concept is more relevant to something deserving to be mentioned in a short list of great books. The idea of like an American mythology being slightly hidden behind a mundane world is more interesting, I think.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
it's got larger scope and drama in it. Although obviously, and I think I've spoken about this before, it has terrible pacing. But if you can get through it, there's some interesting things in it. And,
yeah. Well, I mean, as we discussed, it wasn't written as kind of a singular whole work. It was just sort of snippets he wrote here and there, and he kind of cut and pasted it together. So there's not a lot of the story ends with about 200 pages left, and then the rest of it is wrapping up subplots and just curiosities and things like that. So it's a very oddly paced book. There's also a character who I'm not going to name for people who haven't read it, but pretty much any time the protagonist gets in any sort of tight spot, you can rest assured there's not a whole lot of drama, because there's a Deus Ex Machina character who will show up unprovoked, and we never really figure out how or why, but they just show up and save the day over and over and over again. So it doesn't have a lot of forward momentum beyond sort of the curiosity of like which gods is he going to include next, or like which myth is he going to make reference to next, and oh, did I recognize it? Oh, I know who that is. So it's more like going through a museum and seeing if you can spot what's being referenced in the work.
And your feet will be sore after you get out of the museum, because it's quite a long walk. But sorry, I was wrong, by the way. There is another Terry Pratchett book on the list, which is the We Free Men, which is one of his children's books.
Yeah.
And I think it's a fine book. I think I read it when I was young as well, and it's funny. It's about it's about pixies, right? But they're Scottish pixies, so they're pixies.
Gotcha.
If you know what I mean. They have very thick Scottish accents. They're very violent. They wear kilts. They drink. They steal things, and they sort of imprint upon like a leader in their clan who's always a woman. So that they're sort of like a beehive, right? Where the men are like the worker bees, and they have like one matriarch who's sort of in control of the hive, and who has absolute control over the sort of murderous, thieving mob of pixies.
Right.
And they're also, it's an interesting sort of story, because they're refugees from the fairy world. They've come to the sort of mortal world because they don't want to. Well, they're fleeing it because of the elves and the various other mean creatures that live there.
Gotcha.
So because they've come to another world, they have this idea that they're in heaven, right? They've already died, and this is their reward. for,
Amazing.
for living a virtuous life. So they do whatever they want. They're already dead. You can't kill me. If I die, I just go back to the previous world. So there's nothing for me to worry about.
That's
And I'd
hysterical.
recommend it tremendously. I'm not sure, if I was including just one Terry Pratchett book, it would be that one.
Right.
But I say the characters that develop in that book, 10, 15 books later down the series, are very, very meaningful to the last few books he wrote. So it's probably a good starting point for anyone who's young, maybe, or just wants a light read.
Yeah.
Um, and then the tone shifts, and we go to authors like George R. R. Martin.
Hmm.
I don't know if the first of his um, Song of Ice and Fire books are actually included in here, but is a Storm of Swords the first one? I don't think it is.
I don't
I
believe
can't.
so.
No, I can't really remember what the first one was. But I mean, that's probably a fair mention. At this
Yeah.
point, I'd say it's certainly incredibly well known and incredibly popular. Um, I don't know if it did anything, you know,
Evolutionary.
revolutionary or unique, really, to set it apart from any other sort of dark, low magic kind of fantasy worlds.
Yeah. So it's the third one in the series.
Okay.
Um, I mean, I understand that so Martin, I mean his whole kind of quest with the Song of Ice and Fire series, it's because it's kind of interesting. He primarily wrote sci-fi and horror for most of his career. I mean, he started out with the Twilight Zone. I mean, he was a journalist before that, and then he wrote the '80s. He was a writer, staff writer on the '80s Twilight Zone series, and kind of jumped off of that and wrote almost more in the vein of weird fiction. So, creepy sci-fi fantasy stories, but definitely more on the science fiction and horror side of things. Um, and mostly short stories. So for him, the Game of Thrones series and the people who were familiar with him was a very weird turn because this was massive books on an epic scale, and it was fantasy. Not really his wheelhouse up until that point. And yeah, so I think what's different about it is it does have I mean, it is, what people would call grimdark fantasy. It's nowadays, I think that's a retroactively applied genre designation. But it's pretty grim, and as the name implies, pretty hopeless. The characters are not heroes. There's not a singular hero that you're following on a main quest. It's a bunch of rather miserable, horrible people fighting
There's
self.
horrible people doing terrible things to each other, and the
Right,
one you feel most attached to, I'm sure, will get killed fairly
right.
swiftly. That's the sort
And I
of
mean,
series that is.
he said that he was trying to turn the Lord of the Rings on its head. Um, and I think he definitely did that. I do find it funny that now he recently released a book, a collection of novellas called A Night of the Seven Kingdoms that was written more recently. It was during a break in between books for the Game of Thrones series. And in the foreword, he basically just kind of talks about how he's kind of tired of all the cynical, miserable stuff. And so I mean, A Night of the Seven Kingdoms is set 200 years before the rest of the Game of Thrones books. And it's a lovely little chivalric romance about Dunk the Lunk.
The Lunk or something?
Yeah, Dunk the Lunk, who's a hedge knight, not particularly bright. His master has just died, and he takes on a young squire, a bald, kind of fussy child who seems to know everything about being a knight, despite the fact that he is so young, much more than Dunk does. And the kind of the early reveal is that this is actually the heir to the throne. He's third in line, and Dunk just sees that the kid is bald. He's shaved his head to hide his hair that signifies him as a member of the royal family, and so he calls him Egg. And so it's this story of Dunk the knight and Egg his squire, who are just have this sweet sort of relationship. Dunk doesn't know much, but he always fights for what's right and true. Egg knows everything and is kind of selfish and bratty. And together they sort of balance each other out, the brain and the brawn. And they go on these delightful little quests.
It sounds so much more pleasant.
I mean, it's just the two of them. There's no sexual violence, no real graphic violence of any nature. And yeah, so Martin was just talking about how he was just kind of worn out with all that from the Game of Thrones series, and how he's actually become much more interesting in these two characters, and I can completely understand why, because it's a classic fantasy story.
Yeah. Just in that sort of vein and that time period, I'd say if you wanted to read something that is high fantasy, but also not tremendously high magic, although it's just more present than in George R. R. Martin, is Robin Hobb's series of books. The Assassin series is the first trilogy. There's 4 trilogies altogether. It's sort of swords and dragons and castles, but
Yeah,
very, very beautifully written. A little bit sad, but at the same time very satisfying to read. And
yeah,
it gives you a much, you don't feel quite so depressed, I suppose, after reading them than you do with Martin's books. But it's not on this list. I think maybe that's something I disagree with if we're talking about at least modern fantasy. What
right.
is on here is The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. And I don't know if are there any other books by him? But if there are no other books by him, I think that one as a standalone work just does stand out, and I think is very good. I only read it recently, year before last now. And I must say, I read it very quickly. And then most of the other ones thereafter, although my interest remained.
That tends to be the trend with him. Consistently. So the way that my professor in the sci-fi and fantasy class described it, he wasn't even someone who had specialized in that subject. It was just he had read a few theses that were on that subject, and so the department sort of slapped that class into his lap. So he was kind of an outsider teaching on this subject. It was kind of fascinating, but he did his due diligence and learned everything that he could. One of the things that he was talking about was during his research, he began reading Brandon Sanderson because he hadn't, he kept hearing about him. And it was fascinating to hear how these stalwarts of the genre were, sort of talking down on Sanderson and saying he was, just complete trash and not literary enough and all these sorts of things. And my professor came from that more, I don't want to say high-minded, but he's definitely more interested in literary realism. He was reading all these quote unquote important fantasy authors, and then he picked up Sanderson, and the word he used to describe reading Sanderson was, I devoured him insensibly. He read, entire series, which, Sanderson has almost 25 books out by this point, probably
Most
more.
of them are very long, so
And most of them are very long. But he's, I think he finished the entire Mistborn series in a few weeks. And consistently, that's what I hear from people. Not that exact phrasing, but whether you want to talk down on him or not, when people do kind of dip their toes in, they can't. I mean, they jump in all the way.
So, yeah, no, I totally agree, and he deserves a place on the list. I just want to mention a few more books that I think the list got right. There's Wrinkle in Time, James and the Giant Peach. Anything by Roald Dahl is probably a good thing to include on a fantasy list, just in general. It's certainly something I think almost everyone has a childhood memory of reading, even just in school or by themselves. I don't know. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is one of the most well-known ones. I think one of the best. Right. One of the best ones I can think of.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many from him, Roald Dahl, and it is interesting to me that that he is thought of primarily as a children's fantasy author, because I mean, what he considered himself to be was a horror thriller writer, and he did write that for adults for many years. He actually created the very first anthology series in the vein of sci-fi and fantasy, kind of like the Twilight Zone. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it's interesting to me that he now he's known as this fantasy author for children.
Yeah, and I think we're running out of time for today. And I'd say there's a few other things like the Golden Compass and what was the other one? Princess Bride was here, Worship Down. I think those are all good mentions. But then there are a bunch of things that I'm not familiar with. Doesn't mean they're not good or anything, but I'm not sure that it's ideal in that sense for someone who wants to just read the canon of fantasy books.
Right.
But I think it was an interesting conversation to have anyway. And we'll probably do more in fantasy in the future, right, Oliver?
Absolutely. No, it's a deep and rich subject. So we can dig for a long time.
And with that said, I think thank you for joining me today. My name is Christopher Dean, and you can find me on Twitter at Christopher_Luke_Dean at Twitter, or on writersright.co.za. And my co-host has been Oliver Fox. And you can also find him at writersright.co.za with his many fantastic articles. Just a last mention that Oliver has done a fantasy writing workbook that I advise everyone to check out. Thank you for being here, Oliver.
Thank you.